Marcus Chen pushed his old shopping cart through the back door of Steinway Concert Hall. The wheels made a loud squeaking sound on the marble floor. Inside the cart was his most valuable thing, a small electronic keyboard wrapped in an old blanket. Thick black cables stuck out from every side. A small speaker sat on top, held in place with silver tape. The young man looked around the huge room. His eyes grew wide. He had never been in such a fancy place before. The ceiling was so high he had to bend his neck back to see it. Big windows let in bright sunlight that made everything shine. The walls were covered with pictures of famous musicians from long ago. Marcus was only 22 years old. He worked at a coffee shop during the day and studied music at night school. For 6 months he had saved every extra dollar he could find. He ate cheap noodles for dinner. He walked to work instead of taking the bus. He even sold his old guitar. All of this was so he could pay the $200 fee to try out for the International Young Artist Competition. This competition was a big deal. Musicians from all over the world came here. The winner would get a chance to play with famous orchestras. They would also get money to help pay for music school. For someone like Marcus, this was the chance of a lifetime. But as he looked around the room, Marcus began to feel scared. Other musicians were already there setting up their instruments. They all looked so professional. Their clothes were expensive and perfect. Their instruments were shiny and new. Some had helpers carrying their things. A young woman near the wall was tuning a violin that probably cost more than Marcus made in a whole year. Her bow was made of real silver. The case was lined with soft red velvet. She moved her fingers across the strings like she had been doing it since she was born. Next to her, a tall man in a black suit was sitting at a real grand piano. The piano was huge and beautiful. It was painted in perfect black that reflected the lights above. When the man touched the keys, the sound filled the whole room. It was rich and deep and powerful. Marcus had only heard sounds like that in recordings. Marcus looked down at his own keyboard. It was small and plastic. Some of the white keys were yellow from age. The black keys had worn spots where the paint had rubbed off. The display screen had a crack across one corner. When he turned it on, it made a small buzzing sound that never went away. He had bought this keyboard 3 years ago from a pawn shop. It cost $50, which was all the money he had at the time. The man at the shop said it was broken and might not work. But Marcus took it home anyway. He spent weeks learning how to fix it. He watched videos on the internet. He took it apart and put it back together many times. The keyboard was not just old and cheap. Marcus had changed it in many ways. He had added new parts inside. Wires ran from the keyboard to a small computer he built himself. The computer was made from old parts he found at the electronics store. It did not look pretty, but it worked. Marcus had also written special computer programs for his setup. He was not trained to do this. He learned everything from free videos online. Late at night after work and school, he would sit at his tiny desk in his small apartment. He would type code on an old laptop until his eyes hurt. The programs he wrote were very special. They could do things that expensive equipment could not do. But looking at them now in this fancy hall, they just looked like a mess of wires and cheap parts. A security guard walked over to Marcus. The guard was a big man with kind eyes. He looked at the shopping cart and smiled. "First time here?" the guard asked. Marcus nodded. His throat felt dry. "Yes, sir. I am here for the competition." The guard looked at the keyboard in the cart. His smile got a little smaller. "You sure you are in the right place, son? This is the International Young Artist Competition. It is a pretty big deal." "I know," Marcus said quietly. "I paid the fee. I have my letter right here." He pulled out a folded piece of paper from his pocket. His hands were shaking a little as he showed it to the guard. The guard read the letter carefully. Then he looked at Marcus again. "Well, I guess you are supposed to be here. Good luck to you, kid. You are going to need it." As the guard walked away, Marcus heard some of the other musicians talking. They were speaking in low voices, but he could still hear them. "Look at that guy with the toy piano," one of them said. "What does he think this is, a garage sale? Someone should tell him this is a serious competition," another one said. "He is going to embarrass himself." "I feel sorry for the judges," a third voice said. "They have to sit through that." Marcus felt his face get hot. He wanted to leave. He wanted to push his cart right back out the door and go home. But then he thought about all the money he had saved. He thought about all the nights he had practiced. He thought about his dream of becoming a real musician. He took a deep breath and kept pushing his cart toward the stage area. He had come too far to give up now. As he walked, Marcus saw more and more expensive instruments. There were violins in cases that cost more than cars. There were flutes made of real gold. There were cellos that were hundreds of years old. Each one probably had its own insurance policy. Marcus found an empty spot near the back of the room. It was not the best location, but it was all that was left. He carefully lifted his keyboard out of the cart. Even though it was light, he handled it like it was made of glass. This keyboard was everything to him. He plugged in all the cables and turned on his computer. The small screen lit up with numbers and letters. To other people it looked like nonsense, but to Marcus it was the language of music. It was his way of making his dreams come true. As he finished setting up, Marcus noticed that the room had gotten quieter. People were staring at him. Some looked curious. Others looked confused. A few looked annoyed that he was taking up space. Marcus tried to ignore the stares. He sat down on the small folding chair he had brought. He placed his hands over the keys. They were shaking just a little bit. He was ready to show everyone what his simple keyboard could really do. Victoria Hartwell walked into the rehearsal hall like she owned the place. In a way, she did. She had been the director of the International Young Artists Competition for 15 years. Before that, she had played piano at Carnegie Hall and Lincoln Center. Famous musicians knew her name. Music students feared her sharp tongue. Victoria was 58 years old and had seen everything in the music world. She could tell if a musician was good just by watching them walk. She knew which students would succeed and which ones were wasting their time. She had very high standards, and she was not afraid to tell people when they did not meet them. Today she was wearing her usual black dress and pearls. Her gray hair was pulled back in a tight bun. Her shoes clicked on the marble floor as she walked. She carried a thick folder full of papers about each contestant. She had studied every application carefully. She knew which schools they went to, which teachers they studied with, and what awards they had won. Victoria was talking to her assistant, Maria, about the schedule for the day. They had 37 contestants to hear. Some were very promising. Others were just taking up time. Victoria could usually tell the difference within the first 30 seconds of hearing someone play. The violin student from Germany looks very good on paper, Maria was saying. She won 3 competitions last year. And the piano player from Japan studied with Professor Chen at Tokyo University. Victoria nodded as she looked around the room. Her sharp eyes took in every detail. She noticed which students looked confident and which ones looked nervous. She saw the expensive instruments and the perfect clothes. This was how a serious music competition should look. Then her eyes stopped moving. She stared at something that did not belong. "What in the world is that?" she said out loud. Maria followed her gaze to the back of the room. There was Marcus sitting at his small keyboard. Wires and cables were spread out around him like black spaghetti. His computer screen was blinking with strange numbers. The whole setup looked like something from a garage sale. Victoria's mouth fell open. In all her years running this competition, she had never seen anything like it. This was supposed to be a serious event for serious musicians. What was this kid doing here with his toy piano? She started walking toward Marcus. Her heels clicked louder now. People in the room turned to watch. They could tell something was wrong just by looking at her face. As she got closer, Victoria could see more details that made her even more upset. The keyboard was old and scratched. Some of the keys were missing their letters. The speaker was held together with tape. There was even a coffee stain on one side. Marcus was concentrating on his computer screen. He was typing something with his fingers. He did not notice that the famous Victoria Hartwell was walking toward him with fire in her eyes. "Excuse me," Victoria said in a loud voice. Marcus looked up. When he saw who was talking to him, his face went white. Everyone in the music world knew Victoria Hartwell. Her picture was in music magazines. Students told scary stories about how mean she could be. "Yes, ma'am," Marcus said quietly. Victoria pointed at his keyboard with one finger. Her voice was cold and sharp. "You call that piano?" The words cut through the air like a knife. Everyone in the room stopped what they were doing. Conversation stopped. Instruments went quiet. All eyes turned to look at Marcus and his simple keyboard. Marcus felt his face get hot. His heart started beating fast. He looked around and saw that everyone was staring at him. Some people were smiling like they thought it was funny. Others looked embarrassed for him. "It is a keyboard, ma'am," Marcus said. His voice was so quiet that people had to lean forward to hear him. I know it does not look like much, but it can make good music. Victoria let out a short laugh that had no happiness in it. Good music? Young man, this is the International Young Artist Competition. We have students here who have been training their whole lives. They have studied with the best teachers in the world. They play instruments that cost more than most people make in a year. She gestured around the room at all the expensive instruments. Look around you. Do you see any other toy pianos here? Marcus felt like he was getting smaller and smaller. He wanted to disappear. But he also felt a little angry. His keyboard might not look fancy, but he had worked very hard to make it special. I understand this is a serious competition, Marcus said, trying to keep his voice steady. I paid the entry fee just like everyone else. I have been practicing for months. Victoria shook her head like she could not believe what she was hearing. Practicing on that thing? You might as well practice on a calculator. This is not a middle school talent show. This is a competition for real musicians with real instruments. She turned to Maria, who was standing nearby looking uncomfortable. How did this happen? How did someone with a toy piano get into my competition? Maria looked through her papers quickly. He submitted an application and paid the fee. His letter said he plays contemporary electronic piano. I thought that meant he had professional equipment. Contemporary electronic piano. Victoria said the words like they tasted bad. That is what we call this collection of junk? I have seen better equipment at a children's music camp. By now, a small crowd had gathered around them. Other contestants had stopped practicing to watch the drama. Some were whispering to each other. A few were taking pictures with their phones. Marcus felt like everyone in the room was judging him. He looked down at his keyboard and suddenly saw it through their eyes. It really did look cheap and old compared to everything else in the room. Maybe Victoria was right. Maybe he did not belong here. But then he thought about something his grandmother used to tell him. She always said that it was not about what you had, but about what you did with it. She had raised him after his parents died, and she always believed in him even when no one else did. Marcus looked up at Victoria. His voice was still quiet, but it was stronger now. I know my equipment does not look fancy, but I think music is about more than having expensive instruments. I think it is about what comes from your heart. Victoria's eyes got even colder. Heart? Let me tell you something, young man. Heart does not win competitions. Skill wins competitions. Talent wins competitions. Years of proper training with proper instruments wins competitions. She pointed at his computer screen. What is all this? Are you planning to play video games during your performance? It is software I wrote, Marcus explained. It helps me make music in a different way. Software? Victoria almost shouted. This is a piano competition, not a computer class. We are here to hear music, not to watch someone play with electronics. She turned to address the room. Her voice was loud enough for everyone to hear. I want to make something clear to all of you. This competition is about traditional musical excellence. It is about years of hard work and dedication. It is not about gimmicks or shortcuts or trying to be different just for the sake of being different. Marcus felt tears starting to form in his eyes, but he blinked them back. He would not cry in front of all these people. He had been through too much in his life to give up now. Victoria was not finished. She turned back to Marcus with a look of disgust. I strongly suggest you withdraw from this competition before you embarrass yourself further. There are community centers that might appreciate your little show. This is not the place for it. She started to walk away, then stopped and turned back one more time. And next year we will make sure our application process is more clear about what constitutes a real musical instrument. As Victoria walked away, her heels clicking loudly, the room slowly came back to life. But Marcus could feel people still looking at him. Some looked sorry for him. Others looked like they agreed with Victoria. Marcus sat down at his keyboard and stared at the keys. Maybe he should leave. Maybe Victoria was right and he did not belong here. But something inside him refused to give up. He had come too far and worked too hard to quit now. He was going to show them all what his toy piano could really do. Marcus Chen's story did not start in a fancy music hall. It started in a small apartment above a Chinese restaurant in the poorest part of the city. The walls were thin, and you could always smell cooking oil and spices. The building was old, and the pipes made noise all night. But it was home. Marcus was born with something called essential tremor. This meant his hands shook all the time, even when he was not nervous or scared. The shaking got worse when he tried to do things that needed careful finger movements. Simple things like writing his name or buttoning his shirt were hard for him. When Marcus was 5 years old, his parents took him to see many doctors. They went to the free clinic first, then to bigger hospitals when they could save enough money. Every doctor said the same thing. The shaking would never go away. Some said it might get worse as he got older. All of them said he should not try to do things that needed steady hands. Find something else for the boy to do, one doctor told his parents. Maybe sports where the shaking does not matter. Or maybe he can work with computers someday. But forget about things like playing musical instruments or being an artist. Marcus's parents, David and Lin Chen, had come to America from China when Marcus was 2 years old. They did not speak English very well, but they worked very hard. David washed dishes at 3 different restaurants. Lin cleaned office buildings at night. They both took English classes during the day when they could. The family did not have much money, but they had big dreams. David had always wanted to be a teacher. Lin loved to paint, even though she had never taken art classes. They both believed that in America, their son could become anything he wanted. But when the doctors told them about Marcus's condition, those dreams felt very far away. When Marcus was 7, something amazing happened. His grandmother, who everyone called Nai, came to live with them. She was David's mother, and she was already 70 years old. She had sold everything she owned in China to buy a plane ticket to America. Nai was a tiny woman with wrinkled hands and bright eyes. She spoke very little English, but she understood much more than people thought. She had lived through hard times in China, including years when there was not enough food to eat. She believed that every problem had a solution if you were willing to work hard enough to find it. On her second day in America, Nai watched Marcus trying to eat soup with a spoon. His hands were shaking so much that most of the soup spilled on the table. Marcus was crying because he was frustrated and embarrassed. "Stop crying," Nai said in Chinese. Crying never fixed anything. She sat down next to Marcus and showed him how to hold the spoon differently. She taught him to move his whole arm instead of just his wrist. It took many tries, but slowly Marcus learned to eat without spilling. "See?" Nai said. "There is always another way." As Marcus got older, Nai taught him many tricks for dealing with his shaking hands. She showed him how to write by holding the pencil in a special way. She taught him to tie his shoes using a method she had learned from a one-handed man in China. Most importantly, she taught him never to give up on something just because it was hard. When Marcus was 10, his life changed forever. The family was walking past a music store when they heard beautiful piano music coming from inside. Marcus stopped walking and pressed his face against the window. Inside, a young girl was playing a song that sounded like it came from heaven. "I want to learn to do that," Marcus whispered. His parents looked at each other sadly. They remembered what the doctors had said about musical instruments. "Marcus," his mother said gently, "you know that might be very difficult for you." But Nai had a different reaction. She walked into the store and talked to the man behind the counter. She pointed at Marcus and made gestures with her hands. The man looked confused at first, then he smiled and nodded. "He says you can try," Nai told Marcus in Chinese, "but only for 10 minutes. Marcus sat down at the piano bench. It was a beautiful instrument with shiny black and white keys. When he put his hands on the keyboard, they were shaking more than usual because he was excited and nervous. He tried to play a simple song he had heard on the radio. His fingers hit the wrong keys. His hands shook so much that the music sounded terrible. Other people in the store started to stare. Some looked sorry for him. Others looked annoyed by the noise. After 5 minutes, Marcus's parents wanted to leave. They were embarrassed and worried that people were judging their son. But Nai held up her hand. "Let him finish," she said firmly. Marcus kept trying. Slowly, he began to figure out how to work with his shaking instead of fighting against it. He learned to press the keys at the exact moment when his hands moved in the right direction. It was like catching a ball while it was bouncing. By the end of 10 minutes, Marcus could play a simple melody. It was not perfect, but it was music. Real music that he had made with his own hands. The store owner was amazed. "I have never seen anything like that," he said. "Most people with hand problems cannot play piano at all." That night, Marcus could not sleep. All he could think about was the feeling of making music. It was like nothing he had ever experienced before. For those 10 minutes, his disability had not mattered. He was just a boy making beautiful sounds. The next day, Nai announced that she was going to get a job. She was 70 years old and spoke almost no English, but she was determined. She found work cleaning houses for rich families in the nice part of town. The work was hard and the pay was low, but every week she saved a few dollars. "What are you saving for, Nai?" Marcus asked. "You will see," she said with a mysterious smile. For 6 months, Nai worked and saved. She walked to work every day to save bus money. She ate only rice and vegetables to save money on food. Marcus's parents worried that she was working too hard, but Nai would not listen to them. Finally, on Marcus's 11th birthday, Nai took him back to the music store. She had saved enough money to buy him a small electronic keyboard. It was not new and it was not fancy, but it was his. "Now you can practice every day," she said. "But remember, just because something is hard does not mean it is impossible." Marcus hugged his grandmother so tight that she laughed. That little keyboard became the center of his world. He practiced every morning before school and every evening after homework. His hands still shook, but he was learning to make the shaking part of his music instead of something that got in the way. The other kids at school sometimes made fun of the sounds that came from his apartment. They called it earthquake music because his shaking made the notes sound different from normal piano playing. But Marcus did not care. He was making music, and that was all that mattered. When Marcus was 13, his parents received terrible news. David had been in an accident at one of the restaurants where he worked. A heavy pot of boiling water had fallen on him, and he was badly burned. He had to spend months in the hospital. Without David's income, the family could not pay their bills. Lynn had to work even more hours, but it was not enough. They were going to lose their apartment. That was when Nai made a decision that changed everything. She sold her few pieces of jewelry that she had brought from China. They were the only valuable things she owned, and they had been in her family for generations. But she sold them to pay the rent. "Family is more important than old things," she said when Marcus's parents tried to stop her. During this hard time, music became Marcus's escape. When he was worried about his father or upset about their money problems, he would play his keyboard. The music helped him feel calm and hopeful, but the biggest tragedy was still to come. When Marcus was 15, his parents were driving home from the hospital after visiting David. It was raining and the roads were slippery. Another car ran a red light and hit them. Both David and Lynn died instantly. Marcus was left alone with his grandmother. They both cried for weeks. The apartment felt empty and quiet without his parents' voices. Marcus did not want to play music anymore. Everything reminded him of better times when his family was whole, but Nai would not let him give up. "Your parents worked hard so you could have a better life," she said. If you stopped trying, their work meant nothing. Slowly, Marcus began to play again. But now his music sounded different. It had sadness in it, but also strength. He was learning to put his feelings into the sounds he made. Nai got a second job to make sure they could stay in their apartment. She was now 78 years old and working 12 hours a day, but she never complained. Every penny she made went to keeping Marcus in school and making sure he had everything he needed. "Education is the only thing that cannot be taken away from you," she would say. This was the story that Victoria Hartwell did not know. She saw only a young man with a cheap keyboard. She did not see the years of struggle, the creative solutions, or the love of a grandmother who believed that anything was possible. Marcus had learned to turn his disability into something special. His shaking hands created sounds that no other musician could make. What doctors had called a problem, he had turned into a gift. Now, sitting in the fancy concert hall with all those expensive instruments around him, Marcus thought about Nai. She was 85 years old now and still working every day. She had sacrificed everything so he could have this chance. Marcus's transformation of his simple keyboard into something revolutionary had not happened overnight. It took 3 years of trial and error, countless failed experiments, and more late nights than he could count. What Victoria Hartwell saw as a mess of wires and cheap parts was actually one of the most advanced musical systems ever, created by a single person. The journey began when Marcus was 19 and struggling in his first year of community college. He was taking basic music classes, but his professors did not know how to help him. Traditional piano technique was designed for people with steady hands. Every method they taught him made his tremors worse, not better. Marcus felt frustrated and hopeless. He was falling behind other students who had been playing piano for years with proper teachers. His cheap keyboard could only make basic sounds, Nothing like the rich tones he heard when other students played real pianos. One night, Marcus was in the college computer lab working on homework. The assignment was simple: write a basic program that could add numbers together. But as Marcus worked on the code, he started thinking about something else. What if he could write a program that understood his hand movements? The idea seemed crazy at first. How could a computer program help him play piano better? But Marcus could not stop thinking about it. He started reading everything he could find about music technology and computer programming. Most of the information was very technical and hard to understand. Marcus had never taken advanced computer classes, and some of the concepts were completely new to him. But he was determined to learn. He spent hours in the library reading books about digital signal processing, music theory, and software programming. The first program Marcus wrote was very simple. It could detect when his hands were shaking and try to smooth out the signals from his keyboard. The results were terrible. The program made his music sound robotic and lifeless. Sometimes it would delay the notes so much that the timing was completely wrong. But Marcus did not give up. He kept studying and experimenting. He learned that his tremors were not random. They had patterns and rhythms. Sometimes the shaking was fast and small. Other times it was slow and large. The patterns changed depending on how tired he was, what he had eaten, and even what time of day it was. Marcus started keeping a detailed journal of his tremors. Every day, he would record how his hands felt and how they moved. He timed the shaking with a stopwatch. He made charts and graphs. Slowly, he began to understand his condition better than any doctor ever had. After 6 months of research, Marcus started working on a new approach. Instead of trying to eliminate his tremors, what if he could use them to make his music more expressive? What if the shaking could become part of the performance instead of something to fight against? This idea was completely new. No one had ever tried to turn a disability into a musical advantage before. Marcus was entering territory that no musician or programmer had explored. He began by studying how professional pianists created expression in their playing. He learned that great musicians use tiny variations in timing and pressure to make their music emotional. They would speed up slightly during exciting parts and slow down during sad parts. They would press some keys harder and others softer to create dynamics. Marcus realized that his tremors created natural variations that were actually more subtle and complex than what most pianists could do on purpose. The problem was that these variations were not always in the right places or at the right times. So Marcus began writing software that could learn his patterns and help him control them. The program would analyze his hand movements in real time and predict where his tremors would take his fingers. Then it could make tiny adjustments to ensure that the variations happened at musically appropriate moments. Building this software required Marcus to become an expert in several different fields. He had to understand neurology to learn about tremors. He had to study acoustics to understand how sound worked. He had to master programming languages that even computer science students found difficult. Most of this learning happened at night, after Marcus finished his day job at the coffee shop and his evening classes. He would come home to the small apartment he shared with Nai and work until 2 or 3 in the morning. Nai would often wake up and find him surrounded by books and papers, typing code on his old laptop. "You need to sleep," she would say in Chinese. "Just a little longer, Nai," Marcus would reply. "I am close to figuring something out." The hardware side of the project was just as challenging as the software. Marcus's original keyboard could only send basic information to his computer. He needed much more detailed data about exactly how and when he pressed each key. Since he could not afford professional equipment, Marcus had to build his own sensors. He learned to solder electronic components by watching YouTube videos. He bought parts from electronics stores using money he saved from his coffee shop job. His apartment became filled with tiny resistors, wires, and computer chips. Marcus installed pressure sensors under each key of his keyboard. These sensors could detect not just when a key was pressed, but exactly how hard it was pressed and how quickly. He added motion sensors that could track the movement of his hands in 3 dimensions. He even built sensors that could measure the electrical activity in his muscles. All of this data flowed into his computer dozens of times per second. The software Marcus had written could process all this information instantly and make adjustments to the sound that came out of his speakers. But the most innovative part of Marcus's system was something he called tremor mapping. His software had learned to recognize the unique patterns of his specific tremors. It knew that his right hand shook differently from his left hand. It knew that his tremors changed throughout the day. It could even predict when a particularly strong tremor was about to happen, based on muscle tension. Using this knowledge, the software could work with Marcus's tremors instead of against them. When his hand was about to shake in a way that would create a beautiful vibrato effect, the software would enhance that movement. When the shaking would interfere with a delicate passage, the software would compensate by adjusting the timing or volume. The result was music that sounded completely natural, but had levels of expression that would be impossible for a musician with steady hands to achieve. Marcus could create effects that took other pianists years to master, and he could do it instinctively because the effects were built into his natural movements. As his system became more sophisticated, Marcus added other features. He programmed different modes for different types of music. Classical mode emphasized the traditional piano sound but with enhanced dynamics. Jazz mode allowed for more improvisation and spontaneous expression. Contemporary mode could create entirely new sounds that had never been heard before. Marcus also built a learning system into his software. Every time he played, the program got a little bit better at understanding his intentions. It learned which types of tremor patterns he liked and which ones he wanted to minimize. Over time, the system became like a musical partner that knew his style intimately. The most amazing thing about Marcus's system was that it worked in real time. There was no delay between when he pressed a key and when the sound came out. This was crucial for musical performance, where even tiny delays could ruin the timing and expression achieving. This required Marcus to write extremely efficient code and to build a computer system that could process thousands of calculations per second without any hiccups. He had to optimize every part of his setup for speed and reliability. By the time Marcus applied for the International Young Artist Competition, his system represented 3 years of intensive work and innovation. He had created technology that major companies would later spend millions of dollars trying to replicate. But none of this was visible to the people in the concert hall. They saw only an old keyboard and a mess of wires. They could not see the thousands of lines of code running inside his computer. They could not see the sophisticated sensors hidden inside his keyboard. They could not see the breakthrough algorithms that turned a disability into a superpower. Victoria Hartwell had dismissed Marcus's setup as a toy piano and a collection of junk. But what she was really looking at was one of the most advanced musical instruments ever created. It was a perfect example of how necessity can drive innovation and how limitations can become the source of new possibilities. Marcus had not just learned to work with his disability. He had turned it into his greatest strength. His toy piano could create music that no traditional piano could match. He had proven that innovation often comes not from having the best equipment, but from finding new ways to use what you have now. As he sat in the fancy concert hall surrounded by expensive traditional instruments, Marcus was ready to show the world what real innovation sounded like. He was about to prove that the future of music was not always about having the most expensive equipment, but about having the most creative ideas. The judges and other contestants had no idea what they were about to hear. Marcus's revolutionary system was about to change everything they thought they knew about piano music. The competition schedule was posted on a large board near the entrance. Marcus found his name at the very bottom of the list. He was contestant number 37, the last one to perform. Some people might have seen this as bad luck, but Marcus was grateful. It gave him time to listen to other musicians and calm his nerves. The auditorium was beautiful and intimidating. Red velvet seats stretched back in neat rows. A crystal chandelier hung from the ceiling, casting sparkles of light across the room. The stage was huge, with a perfect black grand piano sitting in the center like a throne. Marcus found a seat in the back row where he could watch without drawing attention to himself. He kept his backpack with his equipment on his lap, checking every few minutes to make sure everything was still there. The first contestant was the violin player he had seen earlier. She walked onto the stage wearing a flowing blue dress, carrying her expensive instrument with confidence. When she began to play, the sound filled the auditorium like liquid gold. Her technique was flawless, every note precise and beautiful. The judges sat at a long table in front of the stage. Marcus could see Victoria Hartwell in the center, writing notes on a scorecard. Her face showed approval as the violinist played. When the performance ended, the applause was enthusiastic. One by one, the contestants performed. There was a young man who played Bach on a cello that was older than America. A woman from France sang opera in a voice that seemed to reach the sky. A teenage boy from Korea played guitar music that sounded like rain and sunshine mixed together. Each performance was incredible. These were some of the most talented young musicians in the world. Marcus began to feel smaller and smaller in his seat. How could his simple keyboard compete with this level of excellence? As the day went on, Marcus noticed patterns in how the judges responded. They loved technical perfection. They appreciated traditional interpretations of famous pieces. They smiled when musicians played exactly what was expected, exactly the way it had been played for hundreds of years. But Marcus also noticed something else. After each performance, the judges would politely applaud and make their notes. Then they would whisper to each other for a few moments before calling the next contestant. Their expressions were professional but not particularly excited. It seemed like they had heard these types of performances many times before. When contestant number 20 played Chopin on the grand piano, Marcus paid especially close attention. The young woman was technically perfect. Every note was exactly where it should be. The tempo was precise. The dynamics followed the traditional interpretation exactly. Victoria Hartwell nodded approvingly and wrote what looked like high scores on her scorecard. But Marcus noticed that she did not seem surprised or moved by the performance. It was beautiful, but it was also predictable. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus began to understand something important. These judges were experts who had heard thousands of performances. They appreciated skill and training, but they were also looking for something special, something they had not heard before. Maybe his different approach was not a disadvantage after all. Maybe it was exactly what this competition needed. Around 4 o'clock, the judges announced a break for dinner. Marcus had been too nervous to eat lunch, but he still was not hungry. Instead, he found a quiet practice room in the basement of the building and set up his equipment one more time. He plugged in all his cables and turned on his computer. The familiar startup sounds and blinking lights were comforting. This was his world, the place where he felt confident and in control. Marcus began playing softly, running through scales and exercises to warm up his hands. His tremors were a little worse than usual because of his nerves, but his system compensated automatically. The software had learned to recognize when he was stressed and adjusted accordingly. As he played, Marcus thought about the piece he had chosen to perform. It was Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, one of the most difficult and famous pieces in all of classical music. Most pianists spent years just learning to play it correctly, and even then few could perform it with real mastery. Marcus had chosen this piece because it was perfect for his system. Rachmaninoff had written music that required incredible emotional expression. The piece had sections that were powerful and dramatic, and other sections that were soft and heartbreaking. It needed a performer who could create many different moods and feelings. Traditional pianists had to work very hard to create these emotional effects. They had to control their finger pressure and timing with incredible precision. But Marcus's tremors, channeled through his technology, could create natural variations that were more subtle and complex than what most pianists could achieve. There was also a personal reason Marcus had chosen this piece. Rachmaninoff himself had suffered from depression and self-doubt. He had gone through periods when he could not compose or perform because he did not believe in himself. But he had overcome these challenges to create some of the most beautiful music ever written. Marcus felt a connection to this story. He had also faced people who did not believe in him. He had also struggled with doubt about his abilities. But like Rachmaninoff, he was determined to prove that great music could come from unexpected places. At 6 o'clock, the competition resumed. Marcus returned to his seat in the back row and continued watching the remaining performances. The quality remained incredibly high. A pianist from Russia played Mozart with machine-like precision. A violinist from Germany made her instrument sing like a human voice. As the evening progressed, Marcus noticed that the judges were getting tired. They had been listening to music for 8 hours. Even the most beautiful performances were starting to blend together in their minds. This actually made Marcus feel more hopeful. By the time his turn came, the judges would be ready for something completely different. They would be hoping for a performance that could wake them up and surprise them. Finally, at 9:30 in the evening, contestant number 36 finished her flute performance. The applause was polite but not enthusiastic. Everyone in the auditorium was tired, including the audience members who had stayed for the entire day. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced the competition coordinator, "we have one final performer this evening. Contestant number 37, Marcus Chen, playing contemporary electronic piano." Marcus stood up slowly, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. He picked up his backpack and started walking toward the stage. The auditorium felt huge and empty, even though there were still about 50 people scattered in the seats. As Marcus walked down the aisle, he could hear whispers following him. People were curious about what contemporary electronic piano meant. Some were probably wondering if this was the same young man they had seen earlier with the strange equipment. Victoria Hartwell looked up from her notes with obvious annoyance. It was late, everyone was tired, and now she had to sit through a performance on what she had called a toy piano. Her expression made it clear that she wanted to get this over with as quickly as possible. Marcus climbed the steps to the stage, his legs feeling shaky. The stage lights were brighter than he had expected, and he could not see the faces in the audience clearly. But he could feel their eyes watching him. He set down his backpack and began unpacking his equipment. In the silence of the auditorium, every sound seemed amplified. The zip of his backpack sounded like thunder. The clink of his cables sounded like breaking glass. Marcus set up his keyboard on a small table at the center of the stage. Next to it, he placed his computer and speakers. He plugged in his cables and turned on his system. The startup sounds echoed through the auditorium. As his equipment came to life, Marcus could hear more whispers from the audience. Some people sounded confused. Others sounded skeptical. A few seemed genuinely curious about what they were about to hear. Victoria Hartwell looked at her watch and tapped her pen impatiently on the table. Her body language made it clear that she expected this to be a waste of time. Marcus sat down at his keyboard and placed his hands over the keys. They were shaking more than usual, but his system was already reading the tremor patterns and preparing to work with them. He looked out at the audience one more time. In the back row, he could see the security guard who had spoken to him earlier. The man gave him a small nod of encouragement. Marcus thought about Nai, who was probably at home worrying about him. He thought about his parents who had dreamed of giving him opportunities like this. He thought about all the people who had told him that his dreams were impossible. Then Marcus took a deep breath and began to play. The first notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 filled the auditorium. But this was not the Rachmaninoff that anyone had ever heard before. This was something entirely new, something that bridged the gap between classical tradition and technological innovation. The auditorium fell completely silent. Every conversation stopped. Every rustling paper went still. Even Victoria Hartwell's pen stopped moving. Marcus's performance had begun and nothing would ever be the same. The first notes that came from Marcus's keyboard were like nothing anyone in the auditorium had ever heard. They started softly, almost like whispers, but there was something magical about the sound. It was still recognizably Rachmaninoff, but it seemed to have extra layers of emotion and meaning. Marcus's tremors, instead of making the music shaky and uncertain, were creating the most beautiful and natural vibrato effects. Each note seemed to breathe and live on its own. The sound was not just coming from the speakers. It seemed to fill the entire space and wrap around every person in the audience. Victoria Hartwell's pen had stopped moving completely. Her mouth was slightly open, and she was leaning forward in her chair. This was not what she had expected at all. This was not an amateur struggling with cheap equipment. This was something extraordinary. As Marcus continued playing, his system began to show its true capabilities. The software was reading his tremor patterns and using them to create musical effects that would be impossible for any traditional pianist to achieve. When the music called for gentle, flowing passages, his tremors created a smoothness that sounded like silk. When the music needed power and drama, the same tremors added intensity that made every note feel urgent and alive. The audience was completely silent, but it was not the polite silence of people waiting for a performance to end. It was the deep silence of people who were experiencing something they had never imagined possible. Some audience members were sitting on the edge of their seats. Others had their eyes closed, lost in the music. Marcus himself was in a state he had never experienced before. All his nervousness was gone. His connection with his equipment was perfect, and he felt like the keyboard was reading his thoughts directly. Every emotion he had ever felt was flowing through his fingers and into the music. The piece moved into its first dramatic section, and Marcus's system began to demonstrate capabilities that even expensive concert pianos could not match. His software was creating subtle harmonic effects that added richness to every chord. The tremors that doctors had called a disability were now generating the most sophisticated musical expression anyone had ever heard. In the audience, other contestants were staring in amazement. The violin player who had performed so beautifully earlier was shaking her head in disbelief. "How is he doing that?" she whispered to the person next to her. The pianist from Russia who had played Mozart with perfect technique was listening with his mouth open. He had spent 15 years studying traditional piano, but he had never heard sounds like this. Marcus was creating effects that seemed to bend the laws of physics. As the music continued, Marcus began to push his system to its limits. He was not just playing Rachmaninoff's notes. He was reimagining the entire piece. His tremors were creating micro-variations in timing that made the music feel spontaneous and alive. It was like hearing the piece being composed in real time. The judges at the front table were completely transfixed. Victoria Hartwell had forgotten to take notes. Her expensive pen was lying on the table, ignored, while she listened with growing amazement to what Marcus was creating. The other judges were having similar reactions. Dr. James Harrison, a famous music professor from London, was leaning so far forward that he was almost falling out of his chair. He had judged hundreds of competitions, but he had never heard anything that combined technical innovation with such deep musical understanding. Marcus's system was also demonstrating its incredible versatility. As the piece moved through different sections and moods, the software seamlessly adjusted to support each new musical idea. During quiet, reflective passages, it enhanced the delicate beauty of each note. During powerful, dramatic sections, it added depth and resonance that made the music feel like it was coming from inside the listener's chest. But perhaps most amazing of all was how natural everything sounded. Despite all the advanced technology and innovative techniques, the music never felt artificial or mechanical. It felt more human and emotional than traditional piano performances, not less. This was because Marcus had designed his system to work with human expression, not replace it. Every effect was based on his own natural movements and intentions. The technology was not controlling the music. It was amplifying and enhancing Marcus's own musical voice. As the piece moved toward its climax, Marcus began to demonstrate capabilities that left everyone speechless. His tremors were creating cascading effects that sounded like entire orchestras. Individual notes were expanding into rich, complex harmonies. The simple keyboard was producing sounds that seemed to come from multiple instruments playing together. Victoria Hartwell found herself with tears in her eyes. She had devoted her entire life to music, and she thought she had heard everything. But Marcus was showing her that there were still new worlds to discover. He was proving that innovation and tradition could work together to create something more beautiful than either could achieve alone. The security guard in the back row was wiping his eyes with his sleeve. He did not understand music theory or technology, but he understood that he was witnessing something special, something that might never happen again in his lifetime. Marcus's performance was also having a profound effect on the other contestants. Many of them had spent years learning to play music exactly the way their teachers had taught them. They had focused on perfection and tradition, following rules that had been established centuries ago. But Marcus was showing them that music could be much more than following rules. He was demonstrating that the most beautiful art often came from finding new ways to express old truths. His disability, which could have ended his musical dreams, had instead opened doors to possibilities that no one had ever imagined. As the piece entered its final section, Marcus's system began to create effects that seemed to defy explanation. His tremors were generating harmonics and overtones that made individual notes sound like entire chords. The music was becoming three-dimensional, with layers and textures that seemed to surround the listeners from all directions. The auditorium's acoustics, designed for traditional instruments, were interacting with Marcus's electronic system in unexpected ways. The sound was bouncing off the walls and ceiling, creating natural reverb effects that made the music feel like it was being performed in a cathedral. Victoria Hartwell was no longer thinking about judging or scoring. She was simply experiencing the music with the wonder of a child hearing their first lullaby. All her preconceptions about electronic music and proper instruments had been completely shattered. Dr. Harrison was frantically scribbling notes, trying to capture what he was hearing so he could study it later. As a music professor, he knew he was witnessing a historical moment. This performance would change how people thought about music, technology, and human potential. Other audience members were having their own profound reactions. Some were crying without knowing why. Others felt like they were floating. A few felt like they were experiencing music for the first time in their lives, even though they had been listening to it for decades. Marcus himself was in a state of perfect flow. His consciousness had merged completely with his music. He was not thinking about technique or technology or impressing the judges. He was simply allowing his emotions and experiences to flow through his hands and into his revolutionary system. Every challenge he had faced in his life was being transformed into musical expression. His struggle with disability, the loss of his parents, his grandmother's sacrifices, his years of poverty and doubt, all of it was becoming part of the most beautiful music anyone had ever heard. The tremors that doctors had called a medical problem were creating musical effects that conservatory-trained pianists could only dream of achieving. Marcus had turned his greatest weakness into his greatest strength, and the result was nothing short of miraculous. As the final section built toward its conclusion, everyone in the auditorium knew they were experiencing something that would stay with them forever. This was not just a piano performance. It was a demonstration of human creativity, determination, and the power of refusing to accept limitations. Marcus was proving that the future of music was not about having the most expensive equipment or following the oldest traditions. It was about finding new ways to touch people's hearts and souls, and he was doing it with a setup that most people had dismissed as worthless junk. The impossible was happening right in front of their eyes, and no one would ever be the same. Victoria Hartwell sat frozen in her chair as Marcus's performance reached its emotional peak. Tears were streaming down her face, something that had not happened during a competition in over 20 years. Her entire worldview was crumbling and rebuilding itself with each note that filled the auditorium. For 15 years, Victoria had run this competition with iron discipline and unwavering standards. She believed that musical excellence came from years of proper training with proper instruments. She believed that tradition and technique were the foundations of great art. She had never wavered in these beliefs. Not once. But now, listening to Marcus transform Rachmaninoff into something completely new and impossibly beautiful, Victoria was forced to confront the possibility that she had been wrong about everything. The music pouring from Marcus's simple keyboard was not just technically impressive. It was deeply, profoundly moving in a way that Victoria had forgotten music could be. It spoke to parts of her heart that had been silent for decades. It reminded her why she had fallen in love with music in the first place. Victoria thought back to her own childhood, when she was 7 years old and heard her first piano concert. She remembered sitting in a dark auditorium much like this one, feeling like the music was speaking directly to her soul. She remembered deciding that night that she wanted to dedicate her life to creating that same feeling for other people. Somewhere along the way, she had lost that feeling. Her focus had shifted from the magic of music to the mechanics of performance. She had become more concerned with technical perfection than with emotional truth. She had forgotten that the greatest art often came from the most unexpected places. As Marcus continued playing, Victoria found herself remembering other moments when she had made quick judgments that later proved wrong. There was the student from a poor family who played violin with tape holding his instrument together. Victoria had almost dismissed him before hearing his incredible talent. He went on to become first chair in the London Symphony Orchestra. There was the young woman who wanted to sing opera, but had a speech impediment. Victoria had initially told her to find a different career. That woman was now performing at the Metropolitan Opera, her unique vocal qualities making her interpretations unforgettable. There was the boy who played jazz piano in a classical competition, breaking all the traditional rules. Victoria had been furious at the time, but his performance had been talked about for years afterward as one of the most creative and inspiring in the competition's history. Again and again, Victoria had seen true artistry emerge from places she least expected. But somehow she had never learned the lesson. She had continued to judge people by their appearance, their equipment, and their conformity to established standards. Now, as Marcus's music washed over her, Victoria finally understood what she had been missing. Real musical genius was not about following rules or using expensive instruments. It was about finding new ways to express the deepest human emotions. It was about turning limitations into strengths and challenges into opportunities. Marcus was doing exactly what the greatest composers and performers throughout history had done. He was taking the musical language that already existed and finding new ways to speak it. He was proving that innovation and tradition could work together to create something more powerful than either could achieve alone. Victoria looked around the auditorium and saw that she was not the only one being transformed by this performance. Dr. Harrison, the stern British professor who never showed emotion, was wiping tears from his eyes. Maria Santos, the tough critic from Barcelona, who was known for her harsh reviews, was sitting with her hands clasped over her heart, completely overwhelmed. The audience members were having equally profound reactions. Some were crying openly. Others sat in stunned silence, afraid to move or breathe for fear of breaking the spell. A few were nodding their heads as if finally understanding something they had been searching for their whole lives. But perhaps most significantly, the other contestants were listening with expressions of wonder and respect. Earlier in the day, many of them had looked at Marcus with pity or dismissal. Now they were recognizing that they were in the presence of something extraordinary. The young violinist who had performed so beautifully that morning was shaking her head in amazement. She had spent 15 years perfecting her technique on a multi-million-dollar instrument, but Marcus was creating more expression and emotion with his modified keyboard than she had ever achieved with all her training and equipment. The Russian pianist who had played Mozart with machine-like precision was listening with his mouth open. He was beginning to understand that technical perfection, while impressive, was not the same thing as artistic genius. Marcus was showing him what it meant to make music that truly touched people's souls. As the performance continued, Victoria found herself thinking about her own musical journey. She had been a child prodigy, playing piano concertos with major orchestras before she was 15. Everyone had told her she was destined for greatness. But somewhere along the way, Victoria's playing had become cold and mechanical. She could execute the most difficult pieces flawlessly, but her performances lacked the emotional depth that separated good musicians from great ones. Eventually, she had stopped performing and focused on teaching and judging instead. Listening to Marcus, Victoria realized what had gone wrong with her own musical development. She had been so focused on avoiding mistakes that she had forgotten to take risks. She had been so concerned with meeting expectations that she had stopped trying to exceed them. Marcus, on the other hand, had embraced his limitations and found ways to transform them into strengths. He had taken risks that no traditional musician would ever consider. He had been willing to fail spectacularly in order to achieve something truly extraordinary. The music was now building toward its climactic finale, and Victoria could feel her heart racing. Every note seemed to contain entire lifetimes of experience and emotion. Marcus was not just playing Rachmaninoff. He was telling the story of every person who had ever struggled against impossible odds and refused to give up. Victoria thought about Marcus's journey to this moment. She imagined him as a child, learning that his hands would never be steady. She pictured him practicing on a cheap keyboard while other students had access to grand pianos. She saw him working late into the night, building technology that no one believed could work. And she thought about her own reaction when she first saw his equipment. "You call that piano?" she had said with such cruelty and dismissal. How could she have been so blind? How could she have missed the years of innovation and dedication that had gone into creating this revolutionary system? Victoria felt ashamed of her earlier behavior, but she also felt something else: gratitude. Marcus had given her a gift by proving her wrong. He had shown her that there were still new worlds to discover in music. He had reminded her that the most beautiful art often came from the most unexpected sources. As the piece moved into its final measures, Victoria made a decision that would change her life. She was going to become an advocate for musical innovation. She was going to use her position and influence to support artists who were pushing boundaries and challenging conventions. She was also going to change how the competition was run. No longer would she judge contestants based on their appearance or equipment. She would focus entirely on the music they created and the emotions they were able to convey. The last notes of Marcus's performance hung in the air like stars. The auditorium was completely silent, as if everyone was afraid to break the magical spell that had been cast. Victoria sat perfectly still, tears still flowing down her cheeks. Her entire understanding of music forever changed. She looked at Marcus sitting at his simple keyboard, his hands still trembling slightly, his face glowing with the satisfaction of having shared his gift with the world. This young man had just delivered one of the greatest musical performances she had ever witnessed. And he had done it with equipment that cost less than most people spent on dinner. Victoria Hartwell, the woman who had built her career on maintaining traditional standards, was about to become the biggest supporter of the most non-traditional musician she had ever encountered, and she could not wait to tell the world about what she had just experienced. The silence that followed Marcus's performance seemed to last forever. The final notes of Rachmaninoff's concerto had faded away, but their emotional impact hung in the air like a living thing. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The entire auditorium existed in a moment of perfect stunned stillness. Then Victoria Hartwell stood up. Her chair scraped against the floor, the sound echoing through the silent hall. Tears were still streaming down her face as she began to clap. Her applause started slowly, each clap deliberate and meaningful. Then it grew stronger, more urgent, as if she was trying to express through her hands what words could never capture. The spell broke. Dr. Harrison leaped to his feet, applauding wildly. Maria Santos jumped up shouting, "Bravo!" in Spanish. One by one, every person in the auditorium rose to their feet, creating a thunderous wave of applause that seemed to shake the building itself. The other contestants were clapping with tears in their eyes. The Russian pianist was applauding so hard his hands hurt. The young violinist was cheering and laughing at the same time. Even the security guard in the back was on his feet, whistling and shouting. Marcus sat at his keyboard, overwhelmed by the response. His hands were shaking more than usual, but now it was from emotion rather than his medical condition. He had dreamed of this moment for years, but the reality was beyond anything he could have imagined. The standing ovation continued for 5 full minutes. People did not want it to end because they knew they had witnessed something that would never happen again. This was not just appreciation for a good performance. This was recognition of a moment that had changed music history forever. When the applause finally began to die down, Victoria Hartwell walked onto the stage. Her professional composure was completely gone. She looked like a person who had just discovered that everything she thought she knew about the world was wrong. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice shaking with emotion, "in my 40 years in music I have never... She stopped, unable to find words that could adequately express what she had just experienced. She turned to Marcus, who was still sitting at his keyboard in a state of shock. "Young man," she said, "I owe you an apology. And I owe you much more than that, what you have just done, what you have just shown us. It will change everything." Victoria looked out at the audience, many of whom were still wiping tears from their eyes. "When I first saw Marcus's equipment today, I dismissed it as a toy piano. I was wrong. Completely, utterly wrong. What I was looking at was not outdated technology. It was the future of music." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "Marcus has proven tonight that innovation and tradition are not enemies. They are partners. He has shown us that the greatest art comes not from having the most expensive equipment, but from having the most creative spirit." The judges' deliberation was the shortest in the competition's history. All 5 judges voted unanimously for Marcus. There was no discussion, no debate. They had all witnessed the same miracle, and they all knew that no other decision was possible. But the announcement of Marcus as the winner was just the beginning of his story. Within hours of the competition ending, videos of Marcus's performance were spreading across the internet. Someone in the audience had recorded the entire thing on their phone, and by midnight the video had been shared thousands of times. By morning it had been viewed by millions of people around the world. Music professors at major universities were calling emergency faculty meetings to discuss the implications of what Marcus had achieved. Technology companies were trying to contact him about his revolutionary software. News reporters were camping outside his apartment building, hoping for interviews. But the most important call came from Juilliard School, the most prestigious music conservatory in America. The dean himself called to offer Marcus a full scholarship, along with resources to further develop his technology. "We need students like you," the dean said. "Students who can show us new possibilities we never imagined." Victoria Hartwell became Marcus's most passionate advocate. She used her connections in the music world to arrange performances at major concert halls. She introduced him to famous musicians who wanted to collaborate with him. She made sure that everyone in the classical music world knew about his revolutionary approach. More importantly, Victoria changed how the International Young Artist Competition was run. She created new categories for innovative musicians who were pushing boundaries. She brought in judges who understood technology and contemporary approaches to music. She made sure that no future contestant would ever be dismissed for having unconventional equipment. The impact of Marcus's performance reached far beyond the music world. Engineers and programmers from around the globe wanted to understand how his system worked. Universities started offering courses that combined music and technology. Companies began developing new instruments based on the principles Marcus had pioneered. But perhaps the most significant impact was on people with disabilities. Marcus had proven that physical limitations did not have to limit artistic expression. Support groups for people with tremors and other conditions began sharing his story. Parents of disabled children saw new possibilities for their kids. Music therapy programs started incorporating Marcus's approaches. 6 months after the competition, Marcus's keyboard system was being manufactured and sold to musicians worldwide. The company that licensed his technology donated a portion of their profits to organizations that provided music education for disabled students. Thousands of people who had been told they could never play music were suddenly discovering their own musical voices. Marcus used his prize, money and early royalties, to bring Nai to one of his concerts at Carnegie Hall. She sat in the front row, wearing the best dress they could buy, crying with pride as her grandson performed for an audience of music's most important people. "I told you there was always another way," she whispered to him after the performance. The boy who had been dismissed for his toy piano had indeed found another way. He had proven that the most beautiful music often came from the most unexpected places. He had shown that innovation and determination could overcome any obstacle. Music schools around the world began teaching Marcus's story alongside the stories of Mozart, Beethoven, and other great composers. Children learned that genius was not about being born with perfect abilities, but about finding creative ways to express your unique gifts. Victoria Hartwell often told people that Marcus's performance was the most important moment in her professional life. "He reminded me why I fell in love with music in the first place," she would say. "He showed me that there are always new worlds to discover, if you're brave enough to look for them." Marcus continued to perform and develop his technology, but he never forgot the lessons he had learned. He established a foundation that provided instruments and training to young musicians who could not afford traditional equipment. He mentored students who were facing their own challenges and limitations. Every time Marcus performed, he remembered the moment when Victoria Hartwell had scoffed at his keyboard and asked, "You call that piano?" Now, when people asked the same question, his answer was always the same: "I call it the future." Marcus had proven that the most powerful music was not made with the most expensive instruments, but with the most determined hearts. He had shown that innovation could honor tradition while pointing toward new possibilities. Most importantly, he had demonstrated that the word impossible was just an invitation to find a different way. The young man with the shaking hands had changed the world, one note at a time. And his story inspired millions of others to believe that they too could transform their limitations into their greatest strengths. In the end, Marcus's toy piano had accomplished something that the most expensive instruments in the world could not. It had reminded everyone who heard it that the most beautiful music comes not from perfect technique, but from an imperfect heart that refuses to give up on its dreams.